That clunking noise over bumps might not be what you think. Because here's the problem. Most people assume it's just a loose suspension part and start replacing components randomly, wasting money without fixing the real issue. But in many cases, the real cause is a worn ball joint, and if you miss it, it can slowly get worse until it starts affecting your steering, tire wear, and even driving safety. The tricky part is, a bad ball joint can feel almost identical to other suspension problems. So in this video, I'm going to show you a simple step-by-step process on how to check if a ball joint is bad and properly confirm it before it becomes a serious problem on the road. Quick symptoms. One of the first signs of a bad ball joint is usually a clunking or knocking sound coming from the suspension, especially when driving over bumps, rough roads, or turning at low speeds. At first, the noise may seem minor. Maybe you only hear it occasionally. But over time, that small clunk can slowly turn into something you start noticing almost every time the suspension moves. You may also begin to feel the steering becoming less stable or less precise than normal. Instead of feeling tight and predictable, the front end can start to feel loose, vague, or slightly unstable, especially at higher speeds. In some cases, you might even feel vibration through the steering wheel, and as the wear gets worse, the tires may begin wearing unevenly because the wheel is no longer staying perfectly stable while driving. But here's the important part. These symptoms don't automatically confirm that the ball joint is bad, because worn tie rods, wheel bearings, control arm bushings, and even suspension links can sometimes create very similar symptoms. That's why the real goal is not just noticing the symptoms, it's learning how to properly test and confirm where the movement is actually coming from. Why ball joints are often misdiagnosed. One of the biggest problems with diagnosing suspension noise is that a bad ball joint can feel almost identical to several other front-end problems. A loose tie rod can create wandering steering. A worn wheel bearing can cause vibration and instability. And damaged control arm bushings can also produce clunking noises over bumps. That's why many people end up replacing parts that weren't actually causing the problem. And sometimes, the ball joint itself may not look completely destroyed from the outside. The rubber boot might still appear intact, and there may not be any major visible damage. But internally, the joint can already be worn enough to create dangerous movement while driving, even before the failure becomes obvious. What makes ball joints especially tricky is that the symptoms usually appear gradually. The noise starts small, the steering looseness feels minor, and because the car is still technically drivable, the problem often gets ignored until the play inside the joint becomes severe enough to affect how the vehicle handles on the road. But once excessive movement develops inside the joint, the wheel is no longer being held as firmly as it should be. That's when suspension noise, unstable steering, and uneven tire wear start becoming much more noticeable. So before replacing anything, the goal is to confirm whether the movement is truly coming from the ball joint and not from another suspension or steering component creating similar symptoms. Test drive check. Before lifting the vehicle or checking anything underneath, the first step is to pay attention to how the car behaves while driving. We need to find out whether the ball joint is actually creating movement while the suspension is under load. Because in many cases, a worn ball joint will start revealing itself through the way the suspension feels and sounds while driving. Start by driving over small bumps, rough pavement, or uneven roads at a moderate speed. Listen carefully to the front suspension area. If you hear a dull clunking or knocking noise when the suspension moves, that's often one of the earliest signs that excessive play may be developing inside the ball joint. Sometimes the sound only happens when one wheel hits a bump. Other times, you may notice it more while turning into driveways, going over speed bumps, or backing out while the steering wheel is turned. But noise alone is not enough to confirm the problem. Pay close attention to the steering feel as well. A worn ball joint can cause the steering to feel loose, unstable, or less responsive than normal because the wheel is no longer being held firmly in its intended position. At higher speeds, the vehicle may start wandering slightly, requiring constant small steering corrections to keep the car straight. You may also notice vibration traveling through the steering wheel, especially on rough roads or during braking. And in more advanced cases, the front end can begin feeling unpredictable, almost like the suspension is shifting slightly underneath the vehicle. At this stage, you're not confirming the failure yet. You're building a pattern, because the more symptoms that appear together, noise, looseness, vibration, and instability, the higher the chance that excessive movement is developing somewhere in the suspension. And next, we need to find out whether that movement is actually coming from the ball joint itself. Visual inspection. Now that we've identified a possible pattern during the test drive, the next goal is to check whether the ball joint is showing visible signs of wear or contamination. To do this properly, the vehicle needs to be safely lifted so the suspension can be inspected more closely. Start by checking the ball joint boot. The rubber boot plays a very important role because it seals grease inside the joint while keeping dirt, water, and road debris out. If the boot is torn, cracked, or leaking grease, contamination can begin entering the joint. And once that happens, internal wear usually accelerates very quickly. Sometimes you'll even see grease splattered around the suspension area, a strong sign that the protective seal has already failed. But here's something many people overlook. A ball joint can still be worn even if the boot doesn't look completely destroyed. In some cases, the joint may already have internal looseness long before obvious external damage appears. That's why visual inspection alone should never be the final confirmation. Next, look closely around the mounting area and surrounding suspension components. If you notice rust dust, shiny metal contact marks, or signs that components have been moving more than they should, it may indicate excessive play developing in the joint. And while you're underneath the vehicle, it's also a good idea to quickly inspect nearby components like tie rods, sway bar links, and control arm bushings, because one of the easiest ways to misdiagnose suspension problems is focusing on only one component too early. At this point, you're narrowing the possibilities down, but the next step is where we actually start checking for physical movement inside the joint itself. "12 and 6 wheel play test." Now it's time to check for actual movement in the suspension. With the vehicle safely lifted and the wheel off the ground, grab the tire firmly at the top and bottom, commonly known as the 12 and 6 o'clock position. A healthy suspension should feel tight and solid with little to no movement. But if you feel a clunk, clicking, or noticeable play, it usually means something in the suspension is worn. Pay close attention to where the movement is coming from. If the play appears near the upper or lower pivot area, there's a strong chance the ball joint is worn and developing excessive internal looseness. In many cases, you may even hear the same clunking noise you noticed during the test drive. However, not all movement automatically means the ball joint is bad. A worn wheel bearing or loose tie rod can sometimes create similar symptoms. That's why it's important to watch the joint itself while someone else rocks the wheel. If the ball joint visibly shifts, clicks, or moves inside the housing, that's a strong sign the joint is worn. And if the movement is still difficult to confirm, the next test can help make the diagnosis much clearer. Pry Bar Test. If the movement still isn't completely obvious, the next step is to check the ball joint under load more closely. For this test, place a pry bar underneath the tire and gently lift upward while watching the ball joint carefully. A good ball joint should remain tight, with little to no vertical movement inside the joint itself. But if you notice looseness, up and down movement, or shifting between the ball joint stud and housing, that's a strong indication the ball joint is worn. In many cases, this test makes internal play much easier to see compared to the wheel shake test alone. And sometimes, you may even hear the same dull clunk that occurs while driving over bumps. This happens because the internal components inside the ball joint are no longer holding proper tension, allowing unwanted movement inside the joint. The important part is making sure the movement is coming from the ball joint itself, not from other suspension components nearby. Because once excessive vertical play develops inside the joint, the wheel is no longer being held securely in its proper position. And that's when suspension noise, unstable steering feel, and uneven tire wear usually become much more noticeable. Good versus bad ball joint. At this point, the difference between a healthy ball joint and a worn one usually becomes much easier to recognize. A good ball joint should feel tight, smooth, and solid. It should hold the wheel firmly in position without excessive movement, noise, or looseness, even when the suspension is under load. When you move it during testing, the motion should feel controlled and consistent, not loose or clunky. But a worn ball joint feels very different. Instead of feeling solid, the joint may move too easily or create noticeable play inside the housing. In more advanced cases, you may actually hear clicking or clunking as the joint shifts during movement. And as the internal wear gets worse, the wheel is no longer being held as securely as it should be. That looseness is exactly what creates many of the symptoms drivers notice while driving: suspension noise, unstable steering, vibration, and uneven tire wear. In severe cases, the joint may become so loose that it can no longer safely support the suspension properly. And that's why even a small amount of play should never be ignored once it starts getting worse. Danger of ignoring a bad ball joint. Once a ball joint starts developing noticeable play during testing, the problem should never be ignored, because unlike normal suspension movement, excessive looseness inside the joint usually continues getting worse over time. At first, you may only notice a small clunk over bumps or slight looseness in the steering, but as the internal wear increases, the wheel can begin moving more than it should while driving, braking, or turning. And once that happens, the suspension may no longer hold the wheel as securely as it was designed to. That extra movement can lead to unstable steering, vibration, uneven tire wear, and additional stress on nearby suspension components. And in severe cases, the ball joint can eventually separate completely. If that happens, the wheel may lose proper support from the suspension, something that can cause immediate loss of steering control. That's why properly checking and confirming ball joint movement early is so important, because catching the problem before the looseness becomes severe can help prevent bigger suspension damage and keep the vehicle much safer to drive. A bad ball joint often starts with a small clunk or slight looseness, but it usually gets worse over time. As wear increases, it can lead to unstable steering, vibration, uneven tire wear, and in severe cases, unsafe wheel movement. The key is early diagnosis, using proper inspection and testing to confirm the real source of the problem before replacing parts. If you're already noticing the signs, don't ignore them. Catching it early can help keep your car safe, stable, and prevent bigger suspension damage later. Thanks for watching, and check out the next video for more suspension problems you should never ignore.